All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. I'm going to get right into the book today. Nuclear Rivalry in the Cold War, 1950 to 1957, on page 978. Link in the description if you want to read along. I think the third paragraph down. The general did not fade away immediately. By May, he was back in Washington as star witness for the prosecution in a congressional investigation into the country's Far East policies. Only an infinitesimal fraction of those who had cheered the general so heartily 2 weeks before paid any attention to the hearings. This was unfortunate. MacArthur seriously maintained that his policies could lead to the total defeat of Communist China without any increase in ground forces, simply by naval and economic blockade of China, by air attack on Chinese industry, and by lifting the wraps off Chiang Kai-shek. On this basis, he promised immediate victory with minimum of risk and casualties. The administration's policy, he insisted, was not victory, but to go on indecisively fighting with no mission for the troops except to resist and fight. A continued and indefinite extension of bloodshed. Subsequent testimony from others, including the country's leading military experts and joint chiefs of staff, showed the unsubstantial nature of this vision of utopia. They rejected MacArthur's ideas as unrealistic and impossible. The bombing of Manchuria alone would take twice as many bombers as the SAC had available. Bombing of Chinese industry would not deprive the Chinese of military supplies as their arsenals were in the Soviet Union. An economic and naval blockade could not seriously injure a country as self-sufficient as China with an open land frontier, and could not be effective at all unless active military combat on the ground increased consumption rates. Efforts to adopt these policies would alienate the United States from its allies and the United Nations, and would jeopardize the whole anti-Soviet position in Europe. Few Americans followed the arguments to this point, but MacArthur had given the opposition a new war cry. In war, there is no substitute for victory. This slogan, in which neither war nor victory was defined, was used as a weapon by the neo-isolationists, partisan Republicans, and radical right for more than a decade, although by 1960 it had been shortened to the charge that Democrats favored a no-win policy. After a decade of reiteration, many persons seriously believed that it was impossible to stop communism without all-out nuclear war, and that continued survival instead of mutual destruction could not possibly be regarded as winning. Peace had become appeasement. These neo-isolationist policies had no relationship to reality, but they exerted great pressure on the last 2 years of the Truman administration, driving it towards an increasingly unrealistic course. In 1950, Senator Taft was advocating a threefold program of reduced military preparedness, reduced government expenditures, and a more aggressive foreign policy in the Far East. This combination could be supported only by assuming a number of things which were not true. One of these was that Chiang Kai-shek's regime on Formosa was still a great power, and that Red China, on the other hand, was on the verge of collapse, and was, indeed, so weakened that Chiang would be enthusiastically welcomed back if he merely landed on the mainland. This unrealistic version of the present could be sustained only by an equally unrealistic version of the past, that the Red victory in China was the inevitable consequence of opposition to Chiang by the Democratic administration of Roosevelt and Truman, and that this opposition was caused by the existence within the administration of communist and communist sympathizers from the top down. Since almost all experts, including scientists, area and subject experts, and military men, did not accept this version, either of the past or the present. All experts were regarded as suspect and insulted or ignored. In fact, educated or thoughtful men were generally rejected. Instead, emphasis was placed on practical men, defined as those who had met a payroll or carried a precinct. This admitted to the charmed circle businessmen and politicians of local stature, like Senator Weary. On the whole, the neo isolationist discontent was a revolt of the ignorant against the informed or educated, of the 19th century against the insoluble problems of the 20th, of the Midwest, of Tom Sawyer against the cosmopolitan East of J.P. Morgan and Company, of the old Sigwash against Harvard, of the Chicago Tribune against the Washington Post or the New York Times, of simple absolutes against complex relativisms, of immediate final solutions against long range partial alleviations, of frontier activism against European thought, a rejection out of hand of all the complexities of life which had arisen since 1915 in favor of a nostalgic return to the simplicities of 1905. And, above all, a desire to get back to the inexpensive, thoughtless, and irresponsible international security of 1880. This neurotic impulse swept over the United States in a great wave in the years 1948 to 1955, supported by hundreds of thousands of self-seeking individuals, especially peddlers of publicity and propaganda, and financed no longer by the relatively tied-up funds of declining Wall Street international finance, but by its successors, the freely available winnings of self-financing industrial profits from such new industrial activities as air power, electronics, chemicals, light metals, or natural gas, which, although utterly dependent on government spending or government-protected exploitation of limited natural resources, such as uranium or oil, pretended to themselves and their listeners that their affluence was entirely due to their own cleverness. At the head of this list were the new millionaires led by the Texas and Southwest oil and natural gas plungers, whose fortunes were based on tricky tax provisions and government-subsidized transportation systems. This shift occurred on all levels, from changing taste in newspaper comic strips from Mutt and Jeff or Bringing Up Father to Steve Canyon or Little Orphan Annie, to profound changes in the power nexus of the American establishment. It was evident in the decline of J.P. Morgan itself, from its deeply anonymous status as a partnership founded in 1861 to its transformation into an incorporated public company in 1940, and its final disappearance by absorption into its chief banking subsidiary, the Guarantee Trust Company, in 1959. Incorporation reflected the need to escape the incidence of the inheritance tax, while its final disappearance was based on the relative degree of large security flotations in contrast to the great increase in industrial self-financing, best represented by DuPont and its longtime subsidiary General Motors, or by Ford. The less obvious implication of this shift were illustrated in a story which passed through Ivy League circles in 1948 in connection with the choice of a new president for Columbia University. This, of all universities, had been the one closest to J.P. Morgan and Company, and its president, Nicholas Murray Butler, was Morgan's chief spokesperson from Ivied halls. He had been chosen under Morgan influence, but the events of 1930 to 1948, which so weakened Morgan in the economic system, also weakened his influence on the Board of Trustees of Columbia, until it became evident that Morgan did not have the votes to elect a successor. However, Morgan, that is, Tom Lamont, did have the votes to preserve the status quo, and accordingly, President Butler was kept in his position until he was long past his physical ability to carry on its function. Finally, he had to retire. Even then, Lamont and his allies were able to prevent choice of a successor and postponed it, making the university treasurer acting president in the hope that a favorable change in the board of trustees might make it possible for Morgan once again to name a Columbia president. Fate decreed otherwise, for Lamont died in 1948, and shortly afterward, a committee of trustees under Thomas Watson of International Business Machines was empowered to seek a new president. This was not an area in which the genius of IBM was at his most effective. While on a business trip to Washington, he confided his problem to a friend who helpfully suggested, "Have you thought of Eisenhower?" By this he meant Milton Eisenhower, the president of Penn State, later president of Johns Hopkins. Watson, who apparently did not think immediately of this lesser-known member of the Eisenhower family, thanked his friend and began the steps which soon made Dwight Eisenhower, for 2 unhappy years, president of Columbia. In the face of public opinion of 1950 to 1952, the Truman administration had to make some concessions to the power of neo-isolationism. The loyalty program to ferret out subversives was established in the government during the MacArthur hearings of May 1951. Dean Acheson promised that, under no circumstances, would Red China be accepted into the community of nations. Aid and support to Chiang was increased, and John Foster Dulles was brought into the State Department. None of these changes helped the Truman administration's popularity, as was clearly shown in the election of 1952, but they had major repercussions on history. One of these was Dulles's success in obtaining a peace treaty for Japan, September 8, 1951. Dulles, like the Columbia presidency, was a former Morgan satellite which had been lost about the same time and for the same reasons. As a partner in Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the Wall Street legal firms closely associated with Morgan, Dulles operated very much in the Morgan vineyard until the late 1940s. An early advocate of bipartisanship in foreign affairs, a Wall Street specialty, he was first brought into Democratic State Department circles, largely under Morgan sponsorship, in 1945 as advisor to Secretary of State Stettinius at San Francisco Conference. These associations continued at various meetings and conferences, mostly at the United Nations and at the 4 post-war foreign ministers' conferences of 1945 to 1949. But in 1948, a change occurred when Dulles's naturally exaggerated personal ambition got out of hand at the same time that he drifted out of the Wall Street constellation with which his whole career had been associated. Apparently, he decided he could get further on his own, especially by adapting himself to the swelling tide of neo-isolationism. The marks of this change were his appointment to the United States Senate by Governor Dewey of New York in July 1949 and his resignation from Sullivan and Cromwell at that time. In the election of November 1949, Dulles was defeated for the full senatorial term by ex-Governor Herbert Lehman, also of a Wall Street background. In the campaign, Dulles tried to portray Lehman as having communist inclinations and went so far as to say that the election of Lehman would permit the communists to chalk up another victory in their struggle to get into office here. In retirement after this electoral defeat, Dulles continued his movement towards isolationism and unilateralism, a process which was completed by his article a policy of boldness in Life magazine, May 19, 1952, and in his subsequent efforts to keep President Eisenhower from standing up against McCarthyism. This movement was marked by increasing neglect of Europe in opposition to our chief allies there and increasing concern with the Far East and the curative powers of strategic nuclear bombing. The Japanese peace treaty was one of the last constructive achievements of Dulles and was reached without support of the Soviet Union, which refused to sign it. Communist China was also excluded. The treaty's chief aim was to end the Pacific War within a larger security structure which bound the previous enemies into a mutual security system. It had three parts: the peace treaty with Japan, which accepted its loss of the already detached areas and islands; the ANZUS treaty, which allied Australia, New Zealand, and the United States; and a bilateral mutual defense pact between Japan and the United States. The neo-isolationist surge in American public opinion so paralyzed the freedom of action of the Truman administration that it was unable to negotiate any settlement of the war in Korea. Every effort at negotiation gave rise to howls of appeasement or treason. Moreover, the communists, while still willing to negotiate, showed no eagerness to make an agreement, with the result that negotiations crawled along for 2 years in the isolated military quarters at Panmunjom in Korea. The Kremlin was quite willing to keep America's men, money, and attention tied down in Korea, and could find each day an additional argument to throw an obstacle into the negotiations. Most of these obstacles were concerned with the disposition of prisoners of war, thousands of whom did not want to return to communist territory, while only 21 captured Americans were unwilling to return to the United States. Simply by insisting that all prisoners must be forced to return, the communists could extend the negotiations indefinitely in time and thus postpone the day when the United States might be free to turn its men and resources to other areas closer to the Soviet Union and thus more dangerous to it, such as Europe. Only the death of Stalin in March 1953 broke this stalemate. As soon as the first confusion over the issue had passed temporarily, it became possible to make a Korean truce, an achievement helped by the accession of a new Republican administration in Washington in January. The truce was signed on July 27, 1953, after 37 months of war in which the United States had lost 25,000 dead, 115,000 other casualties, and about $22 billion in cost. The Korean War had a totally different impact on the scientists, the Democratic leaders, the Army, some of the Navy, the new group of strategic intellectuals and non-middle-class educated persons in general than it had on the neo-isolationists, the Republican leaders, the Air Force, big business, and the newly forming radical right publicists. To the latter groups, it was a totally unnecessary and frustrating experience, resulting from the incompetence or treason of their opponents, an aberration and throwback to World War I, which must never be permitted to reoccur. To the former alignment, however, the limited war in Korea was an inevitable consequence of nuclear stalemate, arising from the very nature of communist aggression and of the revolutionary discontents of the buffer fringe, and would be a constantly threatening possibility in the future, either in Korea itself or in a dozen other places along the edges of the communist bloc. Accordingly, this motley alignment, led by its scientists and liberals, began to work to strengthen America's ability to face any new challenge similar to Korea. In a military sense, this inevitably led to efforts to increase the ability of Europe and America to wage limited war, whatever the cost. The right, as defenders of material comforts, were unwilling to engage in such an effort on the basis of cost alone, and soon convinced themselves that it was unnecessary. The tactical experience of Korea showed clearly that we had neither the weapons nor the training for limited war, and that the Air Force's claims for the effectiveness of its strategic weapons were as unrealistic as they had been since Duhé. Even the tactical air units had been ineffective, chiefly because they were designed and used in a separate service dominated by big bomber generals. Some of the most effective work had been done by tools, such as helicopters, which the Air Force refused to study or order. To remedy this weakness, the Army's specialist on airborne warfare, General James M. Gavin, was sent with a team of scientists to Korea in autumn of 1950. At the time, General Gavin, longtime officer of the heroic 82nd Airborne Division, was much worried at the Air Force's efforts to monopolize all the air and all nuclear weapons, at its resentment at possession of aviation by the Navy and Marines, and at its refusal to provide effective tactical support from the air for ground forces or to buy the equipment needed to provide proper airborne mobility, both of men and supplies for ground troops. The team of scientists who went to the Far East with General Gavin in September to November 1950 included C.C. Lawrenston, professor of physics at the California Institute of Technology, who had deployed the whole array of Navy and Air Force rockets in World War II, and had been Oppenheimer's assistant at Los Alamos during the last year of the war. Dr. William B. Shockley of Bell Telephone Laboratories, developer of the transistor, who won the Nobel Prize in 1956, and Dr. Edward Bowles of MIT, are chief expert on military application of radar in World War II. From their discussions emerged a series of scientific research projects in 1951 to 1952, which had a profound effect on American defense capabilities. Project Vista, with President Lee Dubridge of Caltech as chairman and Lawrenston as his deputy, made an overall study of defense problems for the Department of Defense. In general, it sought to reach a well-rounded, diverse defense establishment which could respond effectively to any degree of aggression and do it on land, air, or sea. One of its chief efforts was to get tactical air power for the ground forces and to counteract the massed Soviet army in Europe by development of tactical nuclear weapons, as well as nuclear warheads to be carried on rockets of 50 to 300-mile range, so that the forcible dispersion of Russian infantry to avoid annihilation would sharply reduce its offensive impact. These weapons could also be used to get all-weather tactical bombing support under Army control to replace the fair-weather Air Force tactical bombing, which had proved so ineffective in Korea. The Vista Report, which was submitted to the Secretaries of the Forces in February 1952, made at least a dozen suggestions, of which at least 10 were eventually carried out, despite the fact that the report was never accepted. The reason for its rejection was the violent opposition of the Air Force, which disliked most of it but really exploded when they found in Chapter 5 that it recommended dividing nuclear material among the three services. The Air Force flatly refused to yield up any fissionable material to the other services. At first, it insisted that there was not enough. When months of argument proved there was plenty, the Air Force simply tripled its requirements. When the Air Force discovered that Oppenheimer had written the introductory section of Chapter 5, his fate was sealed. Stories about his unreliability were passed about, and eventually it was said that he somehow rewritten Chapter 5 and inserted it without the committee members knowing what he was doing. Project Charles and its sequel, Project Lincoln, were equally objectionable to the Air Force, although they had been instigated by it. Charles suggested that a permanent research laboratory should be established to study the technical problems of air defense. Accordingly, in September 1951, the Lincoln Laboratory was set up at MIT. This eventually had a staff of 1,600 people on an annual budget of $20 million. Its special summer project, Lincoln, in 1951 included many of the scientists such as Dubridge, Lauriston, Zacharias, and Oppenheimer of Project Vista. It's estimated that American defense against Soviet air attack was woefully weak and could not expect to knock down more than 20% of the attacking planes, a rate far too low to be acceptable in nuclear warfare. Setting a 70% kill rate as a minimum aspiration, Project Lincoln recommended establishment of a distant early warning radar detection net across Canada and Greenland, the so-called DEW line. Much improved fighter and missile interception in deep air offense, DAD, and the development of an elaborate integrated automatic air defense communication system. The cost of this program, billions of dollars, made it less than welcome to the Air Force. To combat it, Air Force supporters spread rumors that a clique of scientists, which they called ZORC, Zacharias, Oppenheimer, Rabi, and Charles Lauriston, were out to destroy the SAC by devising or pretending to devise a near-perfect air defense for the United States. Thus, DEW, DAD, according to SAC supporters, would be America's Maginot Line, behind which the country would lie helplessly bankrupt from its cost of $100 billion. And that was in 1950, so that's like $500 billion now, or like $1 trillion. The Air Force, from its control over the Lincoln Laboratory budget, was successful in forcing MIT to suppress the DEW-DAD report. At least, it was never published. But part of the story, including the horror story about ZORC, was published in May 1953 issue of Fortune magazine, and some of the rest came out in the 1954 hearing on Oppenheimer's security. The third significant effort in the scientists' campaign for American survival in the early 1950s was known as Project East River. It was also instigated by the Air Force early in 1952 and studied the problem of civil defense through a scientific team headed by Lloyd Berkner of Associated Universities. It advocated a fantastically expensive program of air raid warnings, civil defense shelters, and radar decentralization, but little was ever done about it. Since such a defensive system would undoubtedly save scores of millions of lives in an all-out nuclear war, and would permit the United States to withstand a Soviet first strike, the failure to follow up these recommendations is clearly attributable to the cost, a sum of which many felt we could not afford, and which the Air Force was convinced could be far better spent on building up the offensive power of the SAC. Some of it did go for this purpose. The Air Force, which had 48 wings, of which 18 were Strategic Air Command, in June 1950, when the Korean War began, had 95 wings in July 1952, as the presidential campaign began, and had 110 wings, of which 42 wings were in SAC at the end of 1953, in the last Truman budget. During these years, covering the last four budgets of the Truman period, expenditures on national security increased from $13 billion in 1949 to 1950 to over $50 billion in 1952 to 1953. A fair amount of this increase went for the changes recommended by the scientists, such as the DEW line, increase in Army ground forces from 10 to 20 divisions, and increased air transportation. As a consequence, American power relative to Soviet power reached its highest point in the post-war period about the end of 1953. Then it lost ground until its recovery in the middle missile race of 1958 to 1963. The lines of the earlier buildup, as recommended by the various scientific defense projects of 1950 to 1952, were summed up in a general survey for the incoming Eisenhower administration in NSC 141. This document did not replace but supplemented more intensive efforts in air defense, civil defense, and in military assistance in the Near East and Far East. Right. Now we're on the Eisenhower team, 1952 to 1956. The last 2 years of the Truman administration were marked by waves of partisan propaganda which concealed the major improvements being made in the American defense posture. The American people were irritated and puzzled by the stalemate in Korea, exactly as the Soviets intended them to be. Disruption of the lives of individuals in a war which was not a war, in which nothing seemed to be achieved except unnecessary casualties, and which disrupted the pleasures of the post-war economic boom with military service, shortages, restrictions, and cost of living inflation, could not help but breed discontent. The Republican-Dixiecrat alliance in the Congress made it impossible to deal with domestic problems in any decisive way or with foreign problems outside the independent authority of the presidential office. And through it, all the mobilized wealth of the country, in alliance with most of the press, kept up a constant barrage of communists in Washington, 20 years of treason or corruption of the Missouri gang. In the Truman administration and created a general picture of incompetence and bungling shot through with subversion. That does kind of sound like the government. In creating this picture, the leaders of the Republican Party totally committed themselves to the myth of the neo-isolationist and of the radical right. In June 1951, Senator McCarthy delivered in the Senate a speech of 60,000 words attacking General Marshall as a man steeped in falsehood, who has recourse to lie whether it suits his convenience. One of the architects of America's foreign policy, made by the men high in this government who are concerting to deliver us to disaster, a conspiracy of infamy so black that when it is finally exposed, its principles shall be forever deserving of maledictions of all honest men. When Truman tried to defend his subordinates, an action which Dulles resolutely refused to do when he became Secretary of State in 1953, Senator Taft attacked the president for this combination of human decency with the established legal privileges of the English-speaking world. He was wrong, according to Taft, to assume the innocence of all the persons mentioned in the State Department. Whether Senator McCarthy had legal evidence, whether he has overstated or understated his case, is of lesser importance. The question is whether the communist influence in the State Department still exists. Following the tendencies of the day, Taft reversed his previous support of the Korean War, calling it an unnecessary war, an utterly useless war, a war begun by President Truman without the slightest authority from Congress or the people. A semi-official version of the Republican position appeared in John Foster Dulles' article A Policy of Boldness, which was published in Life on May 19, 1952. This advocated rejection of containment in favor of liberation, to be achieved on a smaller budget and with reduction of the armed forces, leading to a conclusive victory in the near future. All concessions to reality were rejected out of hand. Containment itself was damned as fragmentary reactions to Soviet pressure, as negative, endless, and partial as treadmill policies which at best might perhaps keep us in the same place until we drop exhausted. In place of these, Dulles offered liberation and massive retaliation. These two were not expressly linked together since, apparently, the former, applied chiefly to Eastern Europe, would be achieved simply by making clear that the United States wanted it. At least, Dulles believed that it would come when American policy made it publicly known that it wants and expects liberation to occur. The disastrous consequence of this nonsense appeared in 1956 when East Germany and Hungary rose against the Russians and were crushed by Soviet tanks without Dulles raising a hand to help. The threat of instant massive retaliation as the sole weapon by which the United States would get Russia to adopt more acceptable policies was equally unrealistic. No one, not even Dulles, dared to use it in the face of the Soviet Union's capability for retaliation. Nuclear blackmail is bad, but nuclear blackmail in which the blackmailer has no intention or opportunity to inflict his penalty is pointless and dangerous, unless perhaps such threats help to win elections. It helped to win an election for Eisenhower in 1952. The candidate had no particular assets except a bland and amiable disposition combined with his reputation as a victorious general. He also had a weakness, one which is frequently found in his profession, the conviction that anyone who has become a millionaire, even by inheritance, is an authoritative person on almost any subject. With Eisenhower as candidate, combined with Richard Nixon, the ruthless enemy of internal subversion, as a running mate, and using a campaign in which the powers of Madison Avenue publicity mobilized all the forces of American discontent behind the neo-isolationist program, victory in November 1952 was assured. The coup de grace was given to the Democratic candidate, Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, darling of the academic intellectuals. This page is like faded out. When Eisenhower adopted Emmett Hughes' suggestion that he promise, if elected, to go on to Korea to make peace. Although not himself a neo-isolationist or reactionary, Eisenhower had a few deep personal convictions and was eager to be president. When his advisors told him that he must collaborate with the radical right, he went all the way, even to the extent of condoning Senator McCarthy's attack on General Marshall. This occurred when Eisenhower, under McCarthy's pressure, removed from a Wisconsin speech a favorable reference to Marshall. Once elected, the new president reintroduced the Republican conception of the presidency, which had been used in the 1921 to 1933. This conception saw the president as a kind of titular chairman of the board who neither acted himself directly nor intervened indirectly in the actions of his delegated assistants. Fully aware of his own limitations of both knowledge and energy, Eisenhower allotted the functions of government to his cabinet members, 8 millionaires and a plumber, according to one writer, and expected to be consulted himself only in unsettled disputes or major policy changes. Overall, government operations were divided into two parts, with John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State in charge of foreign affairs and ex-Governor Sherman Adams of New Hampshire in place of Taft, who died in 1953, as Assistant President in charge of domestic matters. Apart from these, the real tone of the administration was provided by three businessmen: George Humphrey, a Taft Republican and president of the great holding company M.A. Hanna and Company, was Secretary of the Treasury and the most influential member of the cabinet. Charles Wilson, president of General Motors, was Secretary of Defense, and Joseph M. Dodge, a Detroit banker with extensive government experience, was director of the budget. The only man in the government who could, with impunity, do or undo acts of Congress. The chief aim of the administration, and almost the sole aim of these three, was to reduce government spending and subsequently business taxes by the greatest amount that would not jeopardize re-election in 1956. Dulles and Adams had to work within the financial framework thus provided. Within this framework, foreign policy was boxed even more narrowly between the realities of the country's world position and the constant hounding of the neo-isolationist groups in Congress, who had been roused to a pitch of unholy expectation by the encouragement they had received from Eisenhower and Nixon during the electoral campaign of 1952. In that campaign, they had discovered that Eisenhower could be pushed. They now concluded that their pushing from without, combined with their pulling of Dulles and Nixon from within, could overthrow the foreign policy lines established by the Truman administration in the preceding 6 years and create a new policy more in accord with their mistaken ideas of the nature of the world. Opposed to this change were the old defenders of the Atlantic system, the remnants of the former Wall Street influence, the Ivy League colleges, the foundations, the newspaper spokesmen of this point of view, the New York Times and Herald Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, and Washington Post, led by Walter Lippmann, and the unrepentant scientists and eggheads straggling behind Adlai Stevenson. Eisenhower as president can be summed up in one word: amiability. He not only liked people, he was also eager to be liked, and was indeed likable. If he gave the impression that he had no firmly held convictions, that was because of two other qualities. He was relaxed, fully willing to live and let live, and in an easygoing tolerance of anything which did not disturb his own peace of mind. He was quick-tempered, but not a fighter. He had convictions, none of them very firm, but he was not prepared to sacrifice his own rest and relaxation for them, except for brief occasions. His span of attention was neither long nor intense. As a consequence, he was a wonderful companion, but not a leader. In all this, the president was the antithesis of his Secretary of State. John Foster Dulles was a tireless and energetic fighter, full of convictions, most of which he saw in black and white terms. He rarely rested and had little time for any relaxation because the world was full of evil forces with which he must wage constant battle. Tolerance and the right to be neutral were to him largely words which had little real meaning in his tightly wound neurological system. To Dulles, it was a real effort not to equate opposition with evil, as he hurried throughout the world, traveling 226,000 miles in his first 3 years in office in pursuit of communism. He was like John Wesley 2 centuries earlier, racing through England in pursuit of sin, both men fully convinced that they were doing the work of God. Eisenhower, who saw the world as a place almost without evil, once told an advisor, "You and I can argue issues all day, and it won't affect our friendship, but the minute I question your motives, you will never forgive me." This lesson would have been lost on the Secretary of State. For Dulles, almost alone in a world full of sin, was always seeking the reason behind the event, the motive behind the action, and was obligated by his own alignment with the righteousness to denounce the reason and the motive when he had discovered them. It must be evident from this that Eisenhower and Dulles, in spite of their close cooperation and almost unruffled personal relations, were very dissimilar, both in personality and in outlook. Dulles was considerably to the right of Eisenhower, and the Republican Congressional Party was far to the right of Dulles. As a result, the two were under constant pressure from the party's isolationist leaders in Congress and from the party's big financial supporters to go further towards neo-isolationism and the right than either Dulles or Eisenhower considered safe. To avoid this, the administration had to do two basically contradictory things: to make verbal concessions to the right and to find its congressional legislative support among the Democrats. In 1953 alone, according to the Congressional Quarterly Almanac, the Democrats saved the president 58 times by their votes in Congress. Some examples of this skirmishing in what was locally known as the Battle of the Potomac form a necessary background to the development of international affairs in Eisenhower's 8 years. The Republican platform of July 1952 had promised to repudiate all commitments contained in secret understandings such as those of Yalta, which aid communist enslavements. In his first speech as secretary, Dulles spoke of the liberation of satellite peoples and told them, "You can count upon us." The Republicans in Congress from then on kept demanding support of these two promises, beginning with the resolution to repudiate Yalta and Potsdam. The administration naturally had to oppose this congressional desire to take campaign talk seriously, since any repudiation of past agreements could be done by Russia more easily than by us and could jeopardize most of our advanced positions in Europe, beginning with Berlin and Vienna. Eventually, the resolution was dropped. A somewhat similar struggle arose over the Bricker and the substitute Dirksen amendments to the Constitution. These would have forbidden the federal government to make any foreign treaties which could not be carried out by powers granted to the federal government elsewhere in the Constitution. This would have greatly hampered the State Department in making agreements such as those with Canada to protect migrating game birds, since the power to do so was not granted elsewhere in the Constitution. The amendment was finally defeated by the administration after a bitter struggle with Republicans in the Congress and only by the support of Democrats. The administration condoned or suffered through all kinds of right-wing attacks, many of them supported by members of the cabinet. Some government employees were harassed for years, even suspended without pay for months or years before final clearance of unfounded charges. Wolf Ladenjinsky, the country's greatest authority on East Asian agriculture and a known anti-communist writer, had been responsible for much of MacArthur's success in occupied Japan as an author of a land reform program which increased agricultural production and largely eliminated agrarian discontent, so that communism in Japan, quite opposite to China, ceased to be a rural phenomenon and was, indeed, largely restricted to student groups in cities. Cleared by the State Department to return to Japan, he was suddenly declared a security risk and suspended by the Secretary of Agriculture, Benson. Attorney General Herbert Brownell, Jr. confided to a businessman's luncheon in Chicago that President Truman, knowing that Harry Dexter White was a Russian spy, had promoted him from Assistant Secretary of the Treasury to Executive Director of the United States Mission to the International Monetary Fund in 1946. Chairman Harold Velde of The House Committee on Un-American Activities at once issued a subpoena to the ex-president to testify before the committee. The summons was ignored. In the resulting controversy, Senator McCarthy attacked the administration over a nationwide broadcast for its failure to force all nations, beginning with Britain, to cease their trade with Red China by threatening to cut off our economic aid. We should say, if you continue to ship to Red China, you will not get 1 cent of American money. The fact that our allies provided us, at great danger to themselves, with military bases on their own soil from which our strategic pressure on the Soviet Union was maintained meant nothing to the total irresponsibility of the radical right. McCarthy's attacks on the United States Information Agency overseas libraries as centers for diffusion of leftist books led to the burning of hundreds of books in these libraries and eventually to attacks on works like Tom Sawyer and Robin Hood as subversive because they did not picture middle-class Midwest American customs. Robin Hood stole from the rich and gave to the poor, clearly a communist tactic. Such harassment of the new administration were almost constant, especially from the right, which was confident it had won the election of 1952 and should be obeyed as a consequence. On April 30th, in Cabinet, Taft blasted the administration for its inability to cut more than $5 billion or $6 billion out of the defense budget. The foreign aid mutual security budget of $7.6 billion left by Truman was cut by Chairman John Tabor of the House Appropriations Committee to $4.4 billion in spite of Eisenhower's request for $5.5 billion. Chairman C.W. Reed of the House Ways and Means Committee, despite Eisenhower's appeal, knocked out the new Truman taxes of 1950 on July 1st, 1953, 6 months before they would have ended anyway. Under right-wing attacks such as these, Eisenhower was largely disillusioned with his job by the summer of 1953 and spent much time over the next 2 years considering how he might get rid of the dominant Republican right and form a new, middle-of-the-road Eisenhower Party. The impracticality of this became apparent to him before the election of 1956. These attacks from the right were much less disturbing to Dulles than they were to the president. The Secretary of State was clear in his own mind on what his aims in foreign policy should be. These aims were largely acceptable to the neo-isolationist and congressional Republicans. Basic to these ideas was his conception of massive retaliation. This was publicly announced in his speech of January 12, 1954, before the Council of Foreign Relations, but had been forecast in his article in Life almost 2 years earlier. Massive retaliation here meant nuclear reprisal by strategic bombing. It was conceived as an alternative to limited war and was intended to be a deterrent to Soviet instigation of such local limited wars. The point at which it would be applied or the degree of aggression necessary to trigger it were both left ambiguous in the hope that the threat would deter aggression in all areas and on all levels. Dulles was really rejecting the whole idea of limited war and saw local defense only as a trigger mechanism for tripping massive retaliation. In this view, he was at one with most of Eisenhower administration. Secretary Wilson, for example, said, "We can no longer afford to fight limited war." Of course, he was thinking in monetary terms. General Gavin, who heard this statement, replied, "If we cannot afford to fight limited wars, then we cannot afford to survive, for that is the only kind of war we can afford to fight." He was thinking of the cost in terms of human lives. As a corollary to the idea of massive retaliation as deterrence, Dulles had the additional idea of local defense and especially local alliances as triggers. Combined with this was his refusal to accept anything but a two-block world by his resolute refusal to recognize any right to anyone to be neutral. On June 9, 1956, in a speech at Iowa State College, he said that America had made bilateral treaties with 42 countries and that these agreements abolish as between the parties the principle of neutrality, which pretends that the nation can best gain safety for itself by being indifferent to the fate of others. This has increasingly become an obsolete conception, and, except under very exceptional circumstances, it is an immoral and short sighted conception. Thus, the Secretary of State indicated his readiness to abandon the non aligned countries to the Soviet bloc and gave Stalin's successors in the Kremlin a tactical opportunity they were already exploiting. At the same time, as we shall see in a moment, Dulles's treatment of our chief allies was generally so autocratic and even contemptuous that they were soon alienated, especially France, which did not have the special relationship with us which kept Great Britain at our side through any slights. The reason for these actions by Dulles was that he was really an isolationist, convinced that American defense rested wholly on American strength, and accordingly, he did not regard his treaty partners as allies at all, but rather as part of an elaborate network of triggers surrounding the Soviet Union. The chief portions of this network were three regional pacts: NATO, the Baghdad Pact, later called Centro or Central Treaty Organization, and SEATO or South Asian Treaty Organization. NATO included the United States, Canada, and 13 other states from Iceland to Turkey by May 1955. The Baghdad Pact of 1955 was largely a Dulles creation, but it did not include the United States. Its members were Britain, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. It was renamed Central Treaty Organization in 1959 when Iraq withdrew and the United States signed bilateral alliances with all its members. The third pact, SEATO, signed in 1954, had 8 members: the United States, Britain, France, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan, with Turkey acting as a link between NATO and Centro, and Pakistan in a similar role between Centro and SEATO. The 3 pacts were intended to enclose the Soviet bloc in an unbroken perimeter of paper barriers which would deter a communist movement outward anywhere by serving as a trigger for American retaliation. Otherwise, Centro and SEATO had little military or political merit and created more problems than they solved. Dulles was not primarily concerned about the military strength of these pacts or about the military contributions of any of these countries could make to a war on the Soviet Union. Above all, he was not concerned with any contribution of a military character the United States could make to the defense of these pacts or areas in any non-nuclear war. Moreover, as triggers, Dulles was not much concerned with the character of the regimes involved or with their military strength. Some mountainous country or tropical jungle of Asia was, for his purposes, about as significant as England or France. Since England and France were already alienated by the whole idea of massive retaliation, which could, so easily, by some independent American act, deluge them with Soviet nuclear bombs, they were even further alienated by Dulles's almost total lack of concern for the fact that they were more cultured and more civilized than other members of Dulles's pacts, that they shared our common Western traditions, of which, indeed, they were the creators, and could contribute more to their own defense with conventional weapons than could some Muslim or pagan areas of Asia. It is no wonder that Dulles, with his unilateralism, his lack of concern for cultural kinship, his readiness to sacrifice all European states in response to a trigger mechanism in some remote and backwards jungle, his almost total unconcern with the possible contribution of limited and conventional warfare to save any areas from communism, it is no wonder, indeed, that Dulles alienated the United States from its natural associates in Western Europe to a degree hitherto unknown in the 20th century. At the same time, Dulles alienated himself domestically from all his older associations within American life and from the forces of rationalization and science which were increasingly a force there. Like Eisenhower, Dulles had an unusual conception of his office. Indeed, it was much more unusual than Eisenhower's. Dulles refused Dulles refused to take any responsibility for the internal functioning of the State Department. His concern was, he thought, only with the high policy of international politics on a world basis as the eyes, ears, and probably the mind of the President. Accordingly, instead of the usual Undersecretary of State, Dulles appointed two, General Walter Bedell Smith to the regular post and Donald B. Laurie, president of Quaker Oats Company, as a second one in charge of all departmental administration. Under Laurie, he named a McCarthyite, R. W. Scott McLeod, as State Department Secretary Officer. In this way, the full disruptive force of McCarthyism was brought into the inner fortress, that is, into the personal security files of the department against which McCarthy and his associates had directed their most blasting assaults. Nor was that all. In his first week in office, Dulles announced his policies to the department and informed its employees that he expected competence, discipline, and positive loyalty. There is nothing objectionable in these three qualities except that Senator McCarthy had temporarily made positive loyalty his own criterion of condemnation. This beginning became worse. Dulles made no effort to protect his subordinates from the attacks made upon the department or on them individually. His justification for this attitude soon destroyed the morale of much of the department and especially of the Foreign Service. Dulles felt that once an employee became the target of a public attack as unreliable, the question of his guilt or innocence became definitely secondary to the question of whether his value to the department had not been destroyed simply by the fact that he had become a subject of controversy. If so, he should be released from service, even if innocent. This point of view, which was almost an invitation to the McCarthyites to increase their attacks, was never, however, applied to Dulles himself when he became, in a short time, a figure of controversy. The real damage to the department arose from the elimination of some of its most knowledgeable members. The radical right, having eliminated almost everyone who knew anything about the Far East, especially those who knew the Chinese language, now under Dulles, shifted their target to those who knew anything about Russia, especially the language. In this way, George Kennan was eliminated and Charles Bolin narrowly escaped. Paul Neitz resigned in disgust. Some of those eliminated found refuge in Ivy League academic posts. The chief victim of the purges was Robert Oppenheimer. The attack on the father of the A-bomb began in the summer of 1953, as soon as Louis Strauss succeeded Gordon Dean as chairman of the AEC. On July 7th, At the request of Strauss, the AEC ordered that classified documents in Oppenheimer's possession in Princeton be taken from him. On November 7, 1953, W. L. Borden, who had earlier left the Joint Congressional Committee for Private Employment with Westinghouse Electric, wrote a letter to J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. The purpose of this letter is to state my own exhaustively considered opinion based upon years of study of the available classified evidence that more probably than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union. This charge was supported by a biased rehash of all the derogatory stories about Oppenheimer, which had been known when Oppenheimer was appointed to Los Alamos by General Groves in 1943. Much of the letter was made up of wild charges which no responsible person has ever been willing to defend. He has been instrumental in securing recruits for the Communist Party, and he was in frequent contact with Soviet espionage agents, according to Borden. The central problem is not whether J. Robert Oppenheimer was ever a communist, for the existent evidence makes it abundantly clear that he was. The central problem is assessing the degree of likelihood that he in fact did what a communist in his circumstances at Berkeley would logically have done during the crucial 1939 to 1942 period, that is, whether he became an actual espionage and policy instrument of the Soviets. On the basis of this letter, and at the direct order of President Eisenhower, Chairman Strauss suspended Oppenheimer's security clearance and thus his access to classified information, without which scientific work for defense is impossible. The news given to Oppenheimer by Strauss on December 21, 1953, 4 days after he received an honorary degree from Oxford University. As provided by law, Oppenheimer appealed the AEC decision to an ad hoc investigation committee of 3 men, one of whom was a scientist. The hearings from April 12 to May 6, 1954, allowed Oppenheimer to have counsel who were permitted to cross-examine witnesses, but the conduct of the hearings was most unsatisfactory. The older assumption, which had been practiced regularly in American history and continued fairly generally in the Truman administration, was that any person had the right to be employed by the government unless something adverse could be proved against them. The chief adverse something in scientific work would be disloyalty. In the course of the years 1951 to 1953, these concepts were changing and were formally modified by President Eisenhower's Security Order 10450 of April 1953. The first change was that public employment was no longer a right, but became a privilege. The second was that disloyalty was no longer the chief criterion, but security was. And the third change was that the government no longer had to prove anything derogatory, but merely needed to have a doubt that a person's employment was consistent with the security of the country. Taken together, these 3 modifications placed the burden of proof on the employee rather than on the accuser and made the area of proof so wide that it could hardly be met. The government has to prove nothing, merely must have a doubt, and that doubt need have nothing to do with loyalty or with the employee's work, but may simply be about his discretion, his drinking habits, his truthfulness, or any other personal characteristics of an adverse kind, whether these operate in the area of his work or not. The task of an employee seeking to dispel the doubt that he may drink 1 too many cocktails before dinner, or that he may gossip or even talk in his sleep is formidable. For example, one of the AEC commissioners who sat in judgment on Oppenheimer's fell asleep in a railroad car on June 11, 1954, with the transcript of the case on his lap and awoke later to find it gone. This was why the transcript was immediately printed and released on June 16th in spite of the assurances that its 40 witnesses throughout its pages that it would be kept secret. The case might be made that an AEC commissioner who lost classified materials by falling asleep while reading them in public was a security risk. He would have some difficulty removing that doubt. The shifting of the burden of proof from the board to the accused and the use of an investigatory tribunal rather than the more familiar technique to English-speaking peoples of an adversary trial made the hearings even less satisfactory. For the accused, faced with the need to establish the truth in order to dispel any doubts of the members of the tribunal, could hardly establish the truth when he had access only to those documents which had been selected by the counsel for the AEC. In this case, the AEC counsel, a one-time United States attorney for the District of Columbia, conducted the hearings as if he were the prosecutor in an adversary trial. He was allowed to use secret data from which evidence was pulled at short or no notice, while Oppenheimer's counsel was excluded from access to classified documents for security reasons. After hearing 40 witnesses through 3,000 pages of typed testimony and perusing an equal quantity of filed documents, the board voted 2-1, the scientist member dissenting, to recommend continued suspension of Oppenheimer's clearance. They concluded that Oppenheimer was loyal and that he was discreet. It would seem, on the face of it, that a person who filled these two qualifications must be secure, but two members of the board had doubts. These hearings have endless interest to the historian of recent American history because they provide one of the few glimpses we have behind the scenes into the decision-making process of our recent government. As far as Oppenheimer is concerned, they show that the animosity against him originated with the Air Force and its close or recent associates. The attack on Oppenheimer came chiefly from the former Air Force pilot Borden, from a long-term Air Force employee David T. Griggs, and from Edward Teller and his close associate L. W. Alvarez and W. M. Latimer. There was obvious personal resentment against Oppenheimer by this group, and cross-examination showed that the majority of them had no personal knowledge of Oppenheimer's work in the matter under discussion. This appeared most clearly when they tried to maintain that Oppenheimer opposed or obstructed the H-bomb effort after Truman's directive to make it had been issued, or that he tried to persuade other scientists not to work on the project. The evidence from persons in a position to have personal knowledge of this matter showed that this charge was not true, and the board rejected it. It is clear from the testimony that the real basis for these men's resentment against Oppenheimer was Air Force resentment of Project Vista and its sequels, especially at Oppenheimer's efforts to provide the American Defense Forces with a full arsenal of diverse weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons, so that the country would not be forced to rely solely or mainly on strategic bombing to play its role in world politics. This point was put very well by Professor Walter G. Whitman of MIT, who was a member of the GAC from 1950 and had been chairman of the Research and Development Board of the Department of Defense in 1951 to 1953. He said, Dr. Oppenheimer was trying to point out the wide variety of military uses of the bomb, the small bomb as well as the large bomb. He was doing it in a climate where many folks felt that only strategic bombing was a field for the atomic weapon. I should say he, more than any other man, served to educate the military to the potentialities of the atomic weapon for other than strategic bombing purposes. Its use possibly in tactical situations or in bombing 500 miles back. He was constantly emphasizing that the bomb would be more available and that one of the problems was going to be its deliverability, meaning that the smaller you can make your bomb in size, perhaps you would not have to have a great big strategic bomber to carry it. You could carry it in a medium bomber, or you could carry it even in a fighter plane. In my judgment, his advice and his argument for a gamut of atomic weapons extending even over to the use of the atomic weapon in air defense of the United States has been more productive than any other one individual. You see, he had the opportunity to not only advise in the Atomic Energy Commission, but advise in the military services of the Department of Defense. The idea of a range of weapons suitable for a multiplicity of military purposes was a key to the campaign, which he felt should be pressed, and with which I agreed. The Strategic Air Command had thought of atomic weapons as solely restricted to its own use. I think that there was some definite resentment at the implication that this was not just the Strategic Air Command's weapon. On the basis of the recommendation of the hearing board, the AEC voted 4-1 with the scientist Henry D. Smith dissenting, not to restore Oppenheimer's clearance. On June 29, 1955, the great scientist's career in government was ended, but his work had been a success. In the interval before the achievement of the thermonuclear bomb in 1955, atomic weapons had been made so plentiful and diverse that they were available for tactical weapons to defend Europe and in sizes small enough to serve as warheads on American missiles of limited boosting power. The motivations of the Eisenhower administration were emotional and complex and represent a sharp reaction against the forces of rationalization and science, which we have discussed. They seem to have been based on three narrowing circles of outlook. The broadest of all was a violent, neurotic rebellion of harassed middle class persons against a long-time challenge to middle class values arising from depression, war, insecurity, science, foreigners, and minority groups of all kinds. This broad problem will be discussed elsewhere. A second, narrower circle of outlook was the basic Republican opposition to all kinds of collective action, including collective security, social welfare, and national security. The third was the obsession of business wealth in the country with the wickedness of unbalanced budgets and high taxes. The Republican opposition to collective action was, of course, of long standing. It is not generally recognized that it appears frequently as an opposition to national security expenditures, especially to defense expenditures for men rather than for equipment, but often for both. Such opposition by Republicans was generally true in the whole period following 1945 and is clearly shown in their votes in Congress. These votes, however, can be understood only in terms of the whole situation. This situation involves at least three levels: public opinion, Congress, and the administration, and in each of these, the two parties. In studying these, we have available the information of public opinion polls, voting records, and formal statements. From these records, it is clear that public opinion always supported large defense forces and did not object to higher taxes or government spending to sustain them. Moreover, this support was stronger from persons of lower educational and income levels, although generally were found on all levels. In sharp contrast to this, public opinion gave much less support to foreign aid, and such support was less on lower educational or income levels and was reflected in far greater opposition to taxation or government spending for economic foreign aid than for defense forces. These statements are based on the file of public opinion polls at the Public Opinion Research Center at Williams College, as studied by Professor Samuel P. Huntington of Harvard University. This study shows that public opinion support for stronger armed forces for the whole period 1945 to 1960 was usually of the order of 2 to 1 and reflected changes in international tensions to a surprisingly limited degree. In Congress, over the same 15 years, there was quite a different situation. There we find, just as existed in the decade before Pearl Harbor, strong Democratic support for armed strength and strong world role for the United States, and fairly consistent Republican opposition both to defense expenditures and to the American involvement in world affairs. On the contrary, the congressional Republican Party members in both periods were more concerned with what they called fiscal responsibility, meaning balanced budgets, reduced government spending, and reduced taxes, than it was with defense or world affairs. Thus, the Democratic Party in Congress was much closer in behavior to public opinion than the Republican Congressional Party was. Professor Huntington had illuminated this difference by an analysis of congressional voting records over the period 1945 to 1960. He has examined votes on 79 controversial defense issues in Congress over the 15-year period and found that a majority of Democrats voted pro-defense on 74 of the 79 issues, while a majority of Republicans voted pro-defense on only 39 of 79 issues. On all these issues, Democratic senators voted 78.8% pro-defense and Republican senators voted only 43% pro-defense, while Democratic representatives voted 78.4% pro-defense and Republican representatives voted 53.8% pro-defense. Moreover, the Republican votes in both houses were less pro-defense in the Eisenhower period than in the Truman period. The Senate Republican pro-defense votes falling from 47.1 to 33% with the change in administration, and the House Republican pro-defense votes falling from 54.8 to 50.4%. Moreover, analysis of these votes on a sectional basis shows that the Republican pro-defense votes were concentrated in the Northeast and on the Pacific Coast, while the Democratic pro-defense votes were spaced relatively evenly around the country. When we shift from the Congress to the administration, we see that the Democratic administration, while still pro-defense, was less so than Democratic congressmen, but that the Republican administration, while not pro-defense, was somewhat more favorable to defense than Republican congressmen. This situation can be explained in terms of the three forces acting upon politicians. 1. The need for votes. 2. The need for campaign contributions. And 3. Awareness of world conditions. On the Democratic side, public opinion, which means votes, works from the people to congressmen, while awareness of world conditions works from the outside upon the administration and through it to Congress. The lobbying of special interest groups and the need for campaign contributions is less significant than the other two forces, but do make the administration somewhat less pro-defense because more pro-balanced budget than Congress. On the Republican side, the influence of special interest is much greater simply because the Republican Party is the party of middle class and business interests. In fact, the influence of lobbying by special interest is so great that it makes both the Republican Congress and the Republican administration relatively immune to the need for defense. With the immunity less general in the administration than the Congress because the former is compelled by its position to pay some attention to world conditions. The Republican congressmen, on the other hand, are relatively immune to both public opinion and the pressure of world conditions, being shielded from the former by the influence of special interest lobbyists and shielded from the latter by the administration. All right. I think I'm going to stop reading there. Finally, on page 1000. Imagine that. Still got like 300 pages to go. Let's see how many. Yeah. 307 pages left. 309 pages left. All right. That chapter was kind of long. We can see that basically the Korean War was pretty unpopular and took longer than usual to end because of political reasons. Oppenheimer got kicked out of the government because the Air Force didn't like the fact that he would be able to design nuclear weapons for the other two branches, the Navy and the Army, that he would be able to design tactical nuclear weapons for those other branches, and the Air Force wanted monopoly over nuclear weapons. And then we can see that the Republicans, were mainly focusing on isolationism at the time. They were highly isolationist, against war, even against kind of building a solidified defense of the United States because it wasn't going to balance the budget. And Democrats basically have always tried to go for the popular vote to get elected. And you can see there's a lot of stuff going on in the background, but the kind of like direct influence of the bankers at this point is kind of fading a little bit, and it's moving more into the like high level industrialists are gaining political power. At least that's what it looks like. Of course, the banks are still there in the background loaning the money to everybody, but it seems like the further we go, it kind of dissipates, that influence dissipates, and then it's getting more into like just regular politics stuff. We'll see where it goes from here. Link in the description if you are compelled to read ahead. We're on page 1000. So that's it for the video today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this anyway. But anyway, have a good day and peace.